Okay. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for everyone who's in the auditorium today and all of you who are Zooming in. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I promise this talk will be just as impactful, and you'll get a chance to see and stare at these pictures up close without having to see me walk around the room frantically. So before I begin my talk, I have to give a shout out to a lot of my amazing collaborators whose ideas and co-work you'll see throughout this talk. So, although, I couldn't have done any of this without them, and they deserve just as much credit as I do. So my goals for the next 35 or 40 minutes or so is to briefly mention the partnerships that exist between the U.S. Geological Survey, where I work, and the National Park Service and other agencies. I'll then give a more in-depth overview of our national park system and climate change research that's been happening for the past couple of decades. I'll then switch to introduce where I work in particular in dryland systems and deserts. And some of the themes I'll hint at are related to my work in ecological restoration, climate change research, and other management challenges related to atmospheric pollution and how we go about making decisions to respond to some of the impacts humans have on our protected systems. I'll then end my talk with what I'm learning about evolutionary biology and ecology from my favorite plant species, the saguaro cactus. So you might be wondering why the U.S. Geological Survey has an ecologist like myself working for them, and it's a complicated history of how science works in the federal government, but USGS is the sole science agency for the entire U.S. Department of the Interior, which includes the National Park Service, the BLM, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I primarily work with the National Park Service, the BLM, and the Fish and Wildlife Service as a collaborator, helping them to answer some of the management questions they have. USGS's mission is to monitor, analyze, and predict current and evolving Earth system interactions and make sure that this information that we produce is relevant to decision makers, including the land managers. USGS's mission is also to provide science about natural hazards in particular, natural resources, ecosystems, and environmental health, and the effects of climate change on land use. So we're not just geology. I have the benefit of being able to work in some of our national parks, which, as many of you probably know, there are 423 national park units across the United States. And just for those in Richmond and nearby, you have access to a tremendous number of natural and cultural resources that the National Park Service manages, including two of the most visited parks in 2021. So the Blue Ridge Parkway and Great Smoky Mountains are consistently some of the most visited parks, in part because of population density and ease of access, but also because these places are beautiful. So I highly encourage you all to consider, short half-day trips or weekend trips to some of these amazing resources near you. So folks have been studying climate change in our national parks with the idea that as climate is changing, the way we manage our parks probably has to change as well. But there's a tremendous effort to understand what those changes are going to look like, what they currently look like as well. We've learned that the impacts of climate change in our national parks is actually there's a greater magnitude of increased temperature and changes in precipitation in our protected public lands than elsewhere in the United States. And that has a variety of reasons related to the management that occurs in these parks, but also where these parks are geographically located. Folks have been uncovering that things like the spring onset across the US national park system is advancing with climate change if you look across the entire park system. We're also revealing that animal species, mammalian species, and biodiversity is changing in our national parks, with some parks seeing mammalian diversity losses of up to 20%, and that is in part due to non-native species invasions into parks that are displacing native species. We're also learning that the way we manage and the types of land uses we allow in our parks has interactions with climate changes. And as a result, that might influence the way we want to manage these systems moving forward. There's a tremendous amount of effort to help the National Park Service, and a lot of this is being led by the U.S. Geological Survey, helping the National Park Service respond to climate changes and how their management strategies might need to adapt to future climate changes. We're also learning from research that there are unfortunately institutional barriers that will influence the way the National Park Service is able to respond to climate change, given the expected levels of bureaucracy and how many decision makers within a large institution like the National Park Service can lead to difficult decision-making practices on the ground. These climate change impacts on protected areas are not unique to the United States. They're occurring in protected areas all across our globe. Here in South Africa, here's a Canadian example. So what we learn about climate change in our national parks in the US and how management might adapt to these changes could be applied to places of biodiversity and conservation across the globe. It would be remiss of me if I didn't mention that our national parks also have tremendous cultural resources that are being impacted and forecasted to be impacted by climate change, and that will influence the way managers and conservationists and preservationists will go about protecting these precious cultural resources for future generations as well. Climate change is also influencing the way you and I and tourists visit our national parks. And study after study is revealing that the human species in particular, when it comes to visiting our national parks, we tend to like climate change, or we like the effects that we're seeing for some of the climate changes, including warmer temperatures, earlier and longer seasons. So as a result, visitation to our national parks is changing and increasing in most situations, which has implications for the way that managers are going to manage those visitors to their parks and the impacts that those visitors will have on the natural and cultural resources in these parks. Unfortunately, more visitors tends to mean more invasive species will appear. And there have been a number of studies that are showing that not only native diversity is declining, but invasive species are on the rise in a lot of our protected areas, in part because the type of management that happens in the national park system versus neighboring federal lands tends to be quite different. And you and I, as tourists, we could enter national parks and in our cars bring along seeds and propagules of non-native species that, once established, can pose quite a big problem to the native species that managers are trying to conserve. So there's a ton of applied research, including some work at the University of Richmond, that's incredibly valuable to land managers who are trying to make decisions about where to control invasive species, where to put their limited resources to make sure that they're the most effective as they can be. And when I talk about invasive species, I often forget that there are not just one or two species at any given park. And this map here shows, if I can get my cursor, that there are in some cases hundreds of invasive species that are present in our national parks, which poses multiple challenges for land managers who are trying to decide, okay, which species do I try to control or manage in a given season to ensure that we'll be able to conserve all of the native species we care about. So I work primarily in the desert Southwest, in drylands in the Southwest. So here is a clip of that map I showed earlier, focusing on the Southwest, and the red stars are national park units where I currently have active research projects that are related to atmospheric pollution, including ozone and nitrogen deposition in our national parks, but also invasive species, how we can restore native species, and how managers make decisions about which species to restore, which species to prioritize, et cetera. And I use a variety of scientific techniques to answer management questions, including climate experiments, where we're actually creating climate change. So you might be able to see faintly in the back of this image, there are these gray bars, which are infrared heaters that are actually creating climate warming. So we're warming the ground, we're warming plant surfaces to see how these ecosystems will respond to warmer temperatures annually. We're also simulating drought, since we work in the Southwest where water is a limiting resource. And as drought continues to be a problem with ongoing climate change, it's really important that we understand how these natural resources will respond to drought in a world where they've adapted to natural drought conditions, but they're intensifying with climate change. I also use some genetic and environmental matching trials where I literally just take seeds from different genotypes that are collected across the desert Southwest, and I bring them into a single environment called a common garden, where they're all grown together to see how they perform, with the idea that we might be able to identify particular species or genotypes that are more suitable for restoration in a changing climate. So I work in the deserts, I work in drylands, and our drylands are important because they're distributed across the globe. So there's a lot we can learn about the natural world by studying our drylands. And there are many ways to define drylands. So this map here defines it as drylands being places where there's less than 600 millimeters of mean annual precipitation. And this covers about 40% of the Earth's terrestrial land surface. Unfortunately, 30 to 50% of our drylands are degraded in some way and in need of restoration. Yet 39% of the world's human population calls these places home, or relies on the resources from these places in a meaningful way. Yet only 6% of terrestrial ecology studies take place in our world's drylands. And unfortunately, less than 5% of restoration studies take place in our global drylands. So our ability to restore and understand the processes that will enable restoration of these degraded lands is quite limited, unfortunately. We are currently in the United Nations declared Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which goes until 2030. And it's described by the UN as this rallying call for protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world for the benefit of people and nature. And it aims to halt degradation of ecosystems and restore them to achieve global goals. Well, I was curious to see how the language describing this decade was written and what it means for drylands in particular. So I took the resolution to enact the decade by the UN and put it through a word tree generator. So I generated this tree, and the colors don't mean anything, but the size of the words represents their frequency in this document, which it's only a 10-page document, but still. So restoration is mentioned 38 times in this proclamation. Forests are mentioned 12 times. Wetlands are mentioned 5 times, but drylands are only mentioned once. They're also mentioned once as deserts, so that's 2 total. Okay, that's somewhat sad, but there's a relative proportion there. Maybe the guide, the playbook that was released last year as a practical guide to healing the planet would do something slightly different in terms of drylands. But sure enough, drylands and deserts aren't mentioned at all. And I checked these subsections just to see if maybe the farmlands or the grasslands were counting drylands, but none of the examples that were provided mentioned drylands or the unique environmental conditions about what restoration might look in these sorts of places. Well, maybe the standards of practice that was released as a draft just this month and is like a multi-100-page document would talk about drylands or deserts in some meaningful way. So I went and compared this original word cloud that was created from the proclamation, and I created a word cloud from this 400-page document about standards of practice to see how drylands might be represented. So restoration is mentioned 444 times, forests are mentioned 7 times, wetlands are mentioned once, and drylands and deserts are mentioned 0 times. So it's initially a little bit concerning that this is the way we're talking about restoration and not mentioning the uniqueness of what restoration might look like in our dryland systems, especially when we can see the impacts of climate change just by looking at our dryland systems. And we have novel terms like mega droughts appearing. So you can just look at the water line and see the visual impacts of climate change on these systems. We also know that many of our drylands are some of the most rapidly warming sites. So here is temperature change from NOAA data since 1895. And there's a black box highlighting Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming that are highlighted in this Washington Post article as being this hotspot of climate change, where it just so happens there are many of the national parks that I study. And I kind of see this as being extremes of climate change that are unfolding, particularly in our drylands. And I think this ties nicely to cultural perceptions of what drylands and deserts are. There are often we often portray drylands as being these barren, desolate wastelands that are representative of the future apocalypse in movies and video games. Everything will look brown and like our deserts in the future apocalypse. And this is kind of an unfortunate way of visualizing drylands and what that means for conservation of these systems in contemporary times. I kind of have a strong interest in desert nostalgia and how we portray desert systems. And I noticed looking at this now defunct magazine called the Desert Magazine, and how covers have changed over time, especially after World War II. We start to describe and portray deserts as being opportunities for production and growth of human populations. And sure enough, many of the fastest growing cities in America are often in the desert Southwest and have been so for the last decade or so. The main way that most humans interact with drylands, if you're not living there, is as a tourist, where we visit drylands and deserts, particularly during times of years when they look not as brown and they look more colorful. And this inspires people to visit these places to experience what are called super blooms, which are these cultural events they're culturally defined events that naturally occur depending on environmental conditions. And this influences how we perceive and view drylands for the rest of the year as well. They're often breathtaking and beautiful and strange and unique, but they only occur for a couple weeks or maybe a month or so out of the year. In recent years, especially with access to media and people who are interested in recreation, the increase in recreation interest and tourism has really driven people to our deserts in larger numbers than ever predicted, which has implications, as I've mentioned before, for management. So here is just a graph of how tourism is so seasonal in these systems and really driven by wildflower visitation. So this graph shows the number of visitors on the y-axis, and it's the difference of the number of visitors from the annual average, which is just to highlight which particular time of year the most visitors are going to these parks in the Southwest. And on the x-axis, we have different months throughout the year, starting with June and July. So you can see on the second half of the graph in January, February, March, and April in particular, that's when the wildflower seasons begin, and that's when the tourists flock to these parks. And what they're going to visit are really these super blooms to take beautiful pictures and experience nature in a really meaningful way. But those super blooms are, as I've mentioned, culturally defined, and they tend to occur during years when the El Nino or the El Nino Southern Oscillation events and winter precipitation in particular are quite strong or above average, which is what I'm showing here. The black dotted dashed line across the graph shows the historic average precipitation during the winter. And you can see that most of the reported super blooms occur in years when precipitation is above average. This has impacts and influences on a variety of things that connects to climate change. So climate change is altering climate variability and those ENSO events and creating increased extremes, which influences the wildflower blooms, which has cascading effects on things like economic growth for a lot of these gateway park towns that are really dependent on tourism as their main vital source of revenue, but that also feeds back into their cultural identity and how they view themselves as desert dwellers, as extremophiles, as people who are, providing access to these natural resources. So we can shift gears to kind of the southern deserts where wildflower blooms or super blooms are kind of the driving force. To some human impacts that are visualized in our deserts, in our colder deserts here in the case of northern Utah. So this satellite image from Google Earth is just a short distance away from Dinosaur National Monument. And the little dots that you might be able to make out in this desert landscape are actually oil and gas well pads that are extracting natural resources primarily on Bureau of Land Management lands, just right next to the National Park Service's Dinosaur National Monument. So sure enough, this type of energy extraction and land use has impacts for places downwind of these sites, including Dinosaur National Monument. So this is what Dinosaur National Monument looks like. It's a breathtaking, beautiful park that's kind of a hidden gem in the National Park Service that has relatively low visitation because not many people know about it. But it's truly one of the most magical places you can visit if you ever get the opportunity. They also have a tremendous archaeological activities that you could explore there, including a multi-million-dollar recently built dinosaur quarry where you can actually see hundreds of amazingly preserved dinosaur specimens in the quarry. So as I mentioned from that imagery map, oil and gas extraction is quite common. And what you can see on this map here is Dinosaur National Monument, where I work, and active oil and gas well pads nearby, which have tremendous consequences for atmospheric deposition into the parks. And what we've been looking at recently is the impacts of oil and gas on ozone and nitrogen deposition in the park, which has impacts on invasive species presence and spread. So these are preliminary data that we just put together that shows ozone, or O3, on the top graph, and oxides of nitrogen, or NOx gas, on the lower graph, just since 2019. And an interesting thing that's quite remarkable is as the COVID-19 pandemic was starting in March 2020, and most of our nation went under lockdown, here in March 2020, almost the entire oil and gas industry shut down during that time. And you can see the impact of that shutdown in energy extraction and production if you look at these nitrous oxide particles during the spring and summer of that year when production was near zero. And what that shows in terms of ozone production is that there's a tight relationship between NOx gas, which is a precursor compound that ends up producing or is used to produce ozone, and that influences atmospheric air quality issues inside and outside of the park. So there's a tremendous amount of influence that humans have, not only on the plants and animals within our parks, but also the air that those plants and animals, and including ourselves, are interacting with when we visit our parks. So now let's shift gears back to the southern hotter deserts, where a lot of my work recently has been focused on the saguaro cactus, this iconic species of the desert Southwest, though it only occurs in Arizona, a small part of California, and a large portion of Sonora, Mexico. And this species is iconic for a number of cultural reasons, the media tends to love this species because of how beautiful and charismatic it is. And in recent decades, this 1935 photo was published in a number of media outlets because this 1998 photo showed a dramatic decline in the number of saguaros that were in Saguaro National Park in particular. But there's a complicated management story that is tied to these two pictures, and maybe partially related to climate change, but also has a long history of land use that you can observe in these photos based on the number of trees that were removed, especially in the early 20th century, which provide habitat for saguaros, but also might be blocking the view in the 1998 photo for saguaros that you can't see that are below the canopy. So we've been studying saguaros, humans have been studying saguaros for over 100 years. And they were first described in 1859 in Engelmann's Cactaceae of the Boundary. And we also received our first botanical illustration of the species at that time, which really romanticizes the Southwest and saguaros in particular. And I think some of this romanticization still sits with us today culturally. Volney Spalding in 1909 published a book called Distribution and Movements of Desert Plants, which is considered by many people to be our first and most impressive understanding of saguaro cactus and their relationship with their environment. Interestingly, however, his wife, Effie, actually is the very first scientist to produce a peer-reviewed manuscript showing saguaros in their ecological environment and how they respond to their environment, though her husband Volney gets most of the credit. And since 1904 and 1909, there's just been a tremendous amount of research on saguaros. And despite all of this, there's still so much that we don't understand about the biology of this species and how it exists and interacts with its environment. And that translates, I think, to like the mystery and cultural obsession or interest in saguaros as being this weird unique alien-like creature that exists in these extreme, somewhat barren environments, and it feedbacks into perceptions, including some of my own perceptions of what deserts are like and why they're interesting and weird. So saguaros have a number of challenges to their conservation, although they're a protected species in Arizona. So here is a map of the distribution of saguaros with the little green saguaros representing their range, and then the lighter reddish tan color is the range of the Sonoran Desert. So you can see they primarily occur in the Sonoran Desert, but some of their range extends outwards. Some major conservation threats include development and land conversion, primarily from human populations, but also for cattle grazing, both legal and illegal harvesting of saguaros in Mexico, things like invasive species and wildfires, which saguaros are, and most desert species are in no way adapted to, but then other human-induced climate changes, including drought and extreme freeze events. So we compiled a report that the National Park Service published recently, describing all of the known climate change impacts to the saguaro cactus, but also what we still don't know and need to investigate further. And this is in part led by the saguaro census, the National Park Service saguaro census, which has been happening every 10 years, where 45 plots that are giant plots where all of the plants are measured and counted, and a bunch of information demographic information is recorded on these individuals. And we can relate this to things like drought to see how saguaro populations are responding to their environment and climate change. Just to describe this massive amount of work that occurs every 10 years, in 2010, for example, everyone measured about over 20,000 individual saguaros. So this takes months to complete this project every 10 years. And what we learned from the most recent set of data is that saguaros really respond to drought in a pretty clear and simple way, that this is just a correlation here of the number of saguaros that established per hectare in any given year on the x-axis, and its relationship to the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is that dashed line following the shape of the bar plots. So there's this really tight relationship between how saguaro populations can regenerate and the severity of drought in any given year. This unfortunately feeds back to some of those human influences and how we're changing the landscape, whether intended or not, including with the introduction of invasive species like the invasive buffalo grass, which is this light grass light-colored grass that you could see throughout this hillside. And unfortunately, this has consequences for saguaro habitat that's not used to having this continuous ground cover connecting saguaro trees and shrubs and nearby vegetation that isn't normally connected in healthy, intact ecosystems. And this is translating to things like really intense wildfires that have never really occurred at the scale and intensity that they have, where saguaros are being torched by these wildfires because they have no ecological or evolutionary adaptation to withstand these types of impacts. So these extremes, not only culturally with the introduction of invasive species and the prevalence of wildfire that's becoming more commonplace, but also these extreme events that climate change is bringing with it, has influence on saguaro populations and what their futures might look like. But it's difficult to not only comprehend, but also to study, just because of how long they can live. They can live for, 150 or more years. And the media catches on to this. And recently we've had an amazingly impressive monsoon season this summer. This article and this individual saguaro in particular has made the headlines. And it's unfortunate that the saguaro perished, though we know that we estimated this plant is probably close to 200 years old, give or take. What the cause of death is. Was it the rain? Was it instability caused by the rain? Or was it just old age? We don't really know. But the media loves this species enough that they're willing to put these images and pictures on their websites and in print, in part because this is the cultural and ecological narrative that gets propagated with how we understand our deserts and these iconic species and how they're responding to climate change. But in the process of studying climate change, and saguaros in particular, we get to learn really amazing things because, like I mentioned, although we've been studying this plant for more than 100 years, there's still so much that we don't know about it. So we recently published a study where we used perhaps the world's largest selfie stick, made out of a collapsible flagpole, to take pictures of saguaro crowns and their flowers in particular, where we could then lay a compass over them and understand or predict why saguaros are producing flowers when and where they do. And what we found is that there's this really unique pattern of floral development in the species where, as the season starts out, flowers almost always start out in the east-northeast quadrant of the crowns. And then as the season progresses, they extend counterclockwise, radially outwards, until the season ends with flowers primarily in the western or southwestern portion of saguaro crowns. And this is something that is new to science. We've never seen this in the plant world before, where there's this really programmed pattern of floral development in an individual plant and how they produce flowers and when they do. So we now have 5 years of data that we're trying to understand not only when and where these flowers are developed on individual plants, but also what are the climate drivers that are creating these patterns or influencing these patterns. We're also now trying to understand saguaros in perhaps the most meaningful way yet, with how they interact with other plant species and soil microorganisms nearby, because we know a lot of the story of saguaros and their environment is actually happening below ground. And Volney Spalding, the perhaps father of saguaro ecology, was one of only 2 people, and I hope to be the 3rd person next year, to look at saguaro root systems in an ecological way, where he mapped out, carefully excavated all of the root structures of a couple saguaros. And I just recreated this here in PowerPoint to make it a little bit more clear, but the saguaro is the red circle, a creosote shrub, perhaps a nurse plant, is the little green circle, and then a palo verde shrub or tree, which also might be a nurse plant, is this purple. And what we found is that what Volney found is that the creosotes, they extend in a meaningful way. Primarily, most of the roots weren't excavated because they went too deep and were outside of the rooting profile of saguaros, which is only about 1 meter deep. And the palo verdes had a shorter rooting profile, at least horizontally. A majority of their roots also went down. But saguaros, they had these amazing rooting profiles that also interacted with the creosote and palo verde shrubs nearby, where in some cases people were, Volney found and another researcher found, saguaro roots tightly wrapped around the root crowns of these nurse trees nearby. And the question is, are saguaros potentially receiving some type of a communication from these other plants in terms of maybe nutrients, maybe it's water resources? We're not really sure, but we're looking into it now. So Volney said in 1909 that the role played by the roots in the distribution of saguaro is probably a most important one, but its value remains to be determined. And that's still true more than 100 years later. And what we're finding in some of our preliminary research is that saguaros not only store water in their main stem, but they also can recycle water and move it at opportunistic times down into their roots and into the soil profile to prevent their roots from experiencing desiccation, so they can maintain important root structures during periods of drought stress. But it remains to be seen whether the types of mega droughts that the Southwest is experiencing will be too severe for saguaros, and how their water strategies may or may not allow them to respond to climate change in a meaningful way, that their populations will be able to be maintained. So there's a lot to learn about our desert Southwest, and we're only really getting into the below ground processes that really drive a lot of the patterns that we look at. But it has tremendous implications for how we manage our lands, but also the types of questions that we as scientists are able to ask on our federal lands about the species that we're trying to conserve for future generations. So I want to end with a quote that some of you may have heard before, from Forrest Shreve in 1931, that the slowness of growth and development in the cacti teaches a lesson of patience, which has incalculable value in our lives of contagious haste. And I, as somebody who studies climate change and also suffers from climate anxiety, I think about this a lot when I'm studying saguaros, because they're so difficult to study because of how long they live and what that means for the limitations of the types of data we can collect on them. But it also can potentially force us to pause and think about our deserts in a meaningful way, not only in terms of how we as humans perceive them, but also how we want to protect and conserve them for future generations as they respond to climate change. And with that, I will take questions if there are any. And I hope you enjoyed this talk. And again, I wish I could have been there in person so we could have interacted a little bit more better. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Daniel, for that. We do have a combination of people who are in person and who are online. So if someone has a question, I'll just ask you to raise your hand, and then I can let you unmute and ask your question in person. Or if you prefer, I will also keep the chat open and I can read the chat questions. All right, Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, Daniel, great talk. Sorry you can't be here. We were really looking forward to see you, but really appreciate your being flexible and kind of still sharing all this stuff with us. It was awesome.
Thank you.
So I have a question about kind of restoration in general, and as we undergo a kind of restoration effort, which I was excited to show you on campus with the Eco Corridor, reflecting on kind of like what you were talking about with national parks and the interaction between restoration and climate change. And the question is kind of, as our planet continues to change, how do you go about setting targets or moving targets for restoration activities, and what kind of like potentially unintended consequences of restoration have you seen or do you consider? Does that make sense?
Yeah, great question. And I could probably give a 3-hour talk on that topic alone. And it's in part because the restoration or target goals that a lot of agencies or the United Nations are setting are quite vague and broad, and they're intended to be that way to make sure that a majority of the world can interact with them in some way. But as I was maybe awkwardly trying to point out, that the way we go about restoration in dryland systems is just so different than anywhere else on the globe, because you can't really restore plants in particular without providing a ton of water. And that's just not something that you can do in the Southwest as well. Couple that with the fact that a majority of the plant species that folks are trying to restore on drylands, especially on our Western public lands, we know very little information about their basic biologies and ecologies or what their germination requirements are. So a lot of agencies have like priority restoration lists of like 10 to 20 plant species that they want to restore with. But in many situations, they don't even know what their ideal growing conditions are. So then, as you mentioned, you couple in climate change and the environment is changing in such a dramatic way, and disturbance has already occurred that we don't really know what the baseline ecological conditions are. And it's quite a big challenge to be able to get plants to grow where we want them to grow, when we want them to grow. So it's a challenge that a lot of managers are struggling with right now. And perhaps the benefit of being in this United Nations decade of restoration is that there's going to be a lot of focus on figuring out or building all of that information that we're currently missing, and is making most restoration in dryland systems really ineffective right now.
Thanks, appreciate it. Invasive species too, like, we're removing, there's all this talk about the potential harms of removing invasive species, and
I know, yeah, especially when a lot of invasive species have been essentially naturalized, where they're now parts of ecosystems and they're providing ecosystem services themselves in some situations. It's a challenging mess.
Super, thanks. Mel, I'm going to jump in really quick first with a question from the chat, and then we'll go to Mel. So in the chat, there's a question from Elizabeth Foray about, is there a hypothesis as to why the saguaro cacti bloom in such the unusual way?
Nothing published, but we are collecting a ton of data on that project, where we're going out with temperature guns and we're measuring the surface temperature of saguaro stems on different orientations around their crowns and on their sides of their stems. And what we're finding is insanely dramatic differences, like 20 or 30 degrees Celsius differences just on different sides of the saguaro stems. So no clear hypotheses yet, but I predict that there are some either growing degree days or thermal degree days that need to be encountered by a particular part of the plant before some trigger sends off in the system to initiate the floral development. But we're still not sure, and that's just a wild guess, so don't hold me to it.
Super, thanks. Now, Mel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I was supposed to talk with you this morning, but oh well.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm airlines. But I'm an evolutionary geneticist by trade, so I don't really know much about this, and it was really cool to gain some insight both on the ecology generally, and also on doing it like through the government versus academia. And my question is, I think, somewhat tied to Todd's, but sort of curious about like the inner workings for you in that type of position. Like ending up on this project, is there in making decisions about which projects to do, like is there a lot of agency on your parts to do that? Is it very top down in terms of like, these are the things to study and we want to bring people in to study these particular things? Is it driven by where academics are doing work and then so you're adding there, or is it where academics are not doing work and then so you're going there? I was just curious a little bit about how those things work.
Great question. And I could probably give a 3-hour response to that as well. And so most of the questions that I ask in my research are not only influenced by my academic background, but also the relationships I already have with a lot of the national park units or the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife Service, where we're essentially the USGS, scientists at the USGS are often considered or described as being scientists for hire within the Department of the Interior and elsewhere, where research science isn't allowed to happen by other DOI agencies except for the USGS. So we are the sole science research provider for those agencies. So I often go to my management partners and they have a long list of challenges that they're struggling to deal with or decide, we have 10% reduced budget in a given year. So it means we can only study one of 3 invasive plant species or control one of 3 invasive plant species. Which one should we focus on most? Which one has the greatest fire risk? Which one has the weirdest genetic diversity that we know might get out of hand if we allow it to continue to spread? So as I'm inherently an applied scientist, because the research that I'm tasked with doing really comes from the managers that I work with, and I'm really just trying to help them meet some of their management goals.
Thank you. That was really insightful.
Thanks.
I'll pause for a minute to see if there are any other questions. And I'll also let you know we are recording this, as I said at the beginning, as part of the GESS seminar series. So this will be available. And if you do have questions, Dr. Winkler is willing to share, and so I can pass along his contact information. Also should acknowledge that he was kind enough to spend some of his spring. We were hoping it was part of the super bloom. We did not get a super bloom this year, but he was a host to one of the University of Richmond classes that traveled out to the desert over spring break. So we appreciate you contributing over and over again.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.
Hope to see you all soon.